Hey team, welcome back to the show. Today I am joined once again by my man Brandon DaCruz, and we're going to be chatting about are women more capable of body recomposition than men? So really just talking through some of the science behind why that might indeed be the case, and then also a lot of our real world coaching experience. So I'm stoked to get into this. Brandon, welcome back to the show, dude.
It is always a pleasure. I can't believe it's already been 2 months, but I'm glad that we're
Two
back for
months
another
too
series
long.
for sure. I'm glad that we're back for another series. I hope this is incredibly valuable for your audience. And this is something that a topic I brought up to you a couple of times, and I'm really glad that we're going to be able to dive into it together because I think that this will be especially relevant and then also helpful for your audience here.
Absolutely. And yeah, it was really cool that you brought this up because this is something I have noticed many times as well, where it just seems that women are capable of body recomposition, losing muscle or losing fat, building muscle at the same time, so much more so than a lot of the males that I've worked with. And again, I'd noticed that many times anecdotally, but it was cool to hear you say that as well. And I've heard a couple other coaches who've like have mentored under speak to the same thing. So I'm excited to get into this. And again, in today's episode, we're really going to be breaking down the potential why that might be from both a science and coaching lens. So to kick things off, let's just define what is body recomposition. And I do think it would probably be helpful here to cover all three different types of body recomp if you're down for that.
Absolutely, man. All right. So when we discuss body recomposition, really what I'm going to be referring to is improving body composition from a lean mass and then a fat mass perspective. And I think one of the most important things to understand right off the bat is that recomposition is not about scale weight. It's about what that weight is made of. And this is really where a lot of people get tripped up. And this is why I want to cover this right off the bat because many people, especially like clients that come to us, they're using the scale as their primary metric of progress. But during a recomposition phase, the scale can really be misleading, and you could be losing body fat, gaining muscle, improving training performance, and looking leaner week to week. And the scale might not move much, or it might move much slower than expected. So if you don't understand what recomposition is, you'll think the process isn't working when in reality, it's working exactly as it's intended. Now, as you mentioned, there are multiple forms of recomp, and I think that it's really important to discuss this because there isn't just one form. Colloquially, when we discuss body recomposition, most people are only going to think of the simultaneous loss of body fat and gain of lean mass. But there's many components, like when I mentioned initially, this is more about shifting and improving your lean mass to fat mass perspective. So first, we can talk about fat loss focus recomp, which is where someone is losing exclusively body fat while maintaining all their metabolically active muscle tissue. And during a fat loss focus recomp, body weight is trending down, but not as quickly as it would if we only focus on losing body weight alone. Because if we only focus on like losing scale weight, that would be a combination of fat mass and lean mass. So you would actually lose scale weight quicker than if you maintained your metabolically active lean mass. Now, this form of body recomp is what I aim for in a structured fat loss phase. I am really trying to get clients to shift away from the scale and really focusing on weight. And really, what we're trying to do is exclusively lose fat mass while maintaining their lean mass so they have a better lean mass to fat mass ratio. Now, the second form, this is the one that I find to be most overlooked, is what I refer to as building focus recomp, which can occur during a lean building phase where you gain muscle while keeping fat gain minimal or non existent. And in this form of recomp, your scale weight will increase, but nearly all of that weight gain comes from lean tissue, and it's going to be a very slow trajectory upwards. And because your total fat mass stays roughly the same, your body fat percentage is actually going to decrease despite you weighing more. So I'll give you an example. If you start the phase of a lean building phase at 150 pounds and you're 20% body fat, you have 30 pounds of fat mass on your frame. Now, if you were to over the course of a lean building phase, gain 10 pounds of muscle, or even over the course of multiple phases, and you're maintaining that same 30 pounds of fat, you actually now weigh 160 pounds, but you're actually 18.5% body fat. So despite the fact that you gained weight, you've actually decreased body fat percentage due to the addition of lean mass. Now, the third form of body recomp is the process of simultaneous fat loss and muscle gain. And this is the version of body recomp that most people are familiar with. And so in this form of recomp, you're going to lose fat mass while gaining lean mass at the same time. And because fat loss and muscle gain are happening simultaneously or at the same time, your scale weight may stay relatively stable or it'll shift only slightly in either direction, meaning either up or down. And usually it's going to be down. And in this case, like if you were to lose 5 pounds of fat while gaining 5 pounds of muscle over an extended period of time, your body weight will not change, but your body composition is going to improve drastically. So in this form of recomp, your scale weight is mostly flat, and this is what I usually see most commonly, but your physique is tightening up and your strength is improving. So throughout the course of this podcast, when we discuss body recomposition, really what I'm going to be referring to is an improvement in body composition where we improve your lean mass to fat mass ratio. And it can be done in any of those specific methods. But really, what I find to be most common in women are the form of fat loss focus recomp, which happens during a fat loss phase, or the most common form of body recomp, which is just normal body recomp, which is a simultaneous loss in body fat with an increase in lean mass.
And I do think though that other form where maybe maintaining body fat or even slightly gaining body fat but adding drastically more muscle than body fat and thus still seeing body recomposition is very important for the listener to understand as well, because especially like we have a lot of individuals who work with us who are already very lean and want body recomposition, and like, hey, that's what it's going to look like for us. So it might actually be like you are seeing the scale actively increase relative to where
Yes.
you started. So as you said, letting go of just that focus on the scale as a determinant of progress here is super important. Let's dig into just a couple myths. First, you'll often hear that it isn't possible to gain muscle and lose fat simultaneously. We have to choose one or the other. I'm assuming, since this is a podcast about body recomp, that that's inaccurate.
Yeah, man. So I think that this is the most common trope that I hear in this industry. And I think that this comes from a poor understanding from a physiological perspective. Many people are under the impression that it is impossible to gain lean mass and to lose body fat at the same time. And really, that comes largely down to oversimplifying the physiology behind fat loss and behind muscle gain and almost looking at them as completely separate processes that cannot happen concurrently. So when people hear that fat loss requires a calorie deficit and muscle gain requires a calorie surplus, they assume that these two processes can occur at the same time. But when you actually break it down physiologically, these processes are regulated by different mechanisms. So we know that fat loss is energy deficit induced. So it's energy dependent process. And it's going to be primarily driven by creating a negative energy balance where you are consuming less than you are burning. And so when you're in a deficit, your body's going to need to pull from stored energy reserves, which largely comes from fat tissue, which is how fat is liberated, it's burned, and it's lost. Now, muscle growth, on the other hand, is a signal dependent process driven by mechanical tension from resistance training, progressive overload over time, and sufficient protein intake so that you have the amino acids available to actually reconstruct and go through that process of stimulating muscle protein synthesis and adding those new contractile proteins. So the body doesn't necessarily need a calorie surplus to build muscle, although it is helpful. So if we were talking just maximizing muscle gain, we're not talking about the fat loss perspective side of things, I would err towards maintenance or a slight surplus for maximizing muscle gain. But that does not mean just because something is helpful does not mean it's necessary. But from a physiological perspective, your body just needs the right signals and just enough available resources to build lean mass. And this is where stored body fat really becomes important, because if you have sufficient energy stored on your body in the form of body fat, you can use that stored fat to meet energy demands. And then you can use your dietary protein and the training stimulus to support muscle protein synthesis and the addition of new skeletal muscle tissue. So we can have a scenario where you're in a slight deficit overall. Your fat mass is actually decreasing because of that deficit, but your muscle protein synthesis is still getting elevated enough to build or at least maintain tissue because of the ingestion of an adequate protein intake and then also very hard and stimulative training. And that's what's going to lead to recomp. So it's a misnomer when people say that these two things can't happen simultaneously.
Okay, very well put. So the other common misconception you'll hear is that recomp only happens in two conditions or populations: new trainees and obese individuals. Kind of the same token, but would you say this is accurate or no?
No, I think that this is the one that, from a anecdotal and experience-based perspective, I agree with the least, or I disagree with the most. Now, I will acknowledge the fact that it is true that new trainees and then also individuals with higher body fat levels have the highest likelihood, or more so, they have the easiest time achieving this, and they will often achieve the greatest magnitude of recomp. But recomp is not limited to these populations, and that's not what we see in research and not what I see in practice. I mean, we have studies on resistant trained individuals. We have case studies on physique athletes, including uh, women that are getting to stage level condition in the physique realm, in bikini. We have the same thing with men's physique. Um, and then we also have a lot of real world coaching data showing that recomposition can still occur in more advanced trainees. Now, the important distinction here is that the magnitude of recomp is typically smaller, and the level of precision required to achieve that is much higher. So for a more advanced trainee, you're closer to your genetic ceiling. Your rate of muscle growth is often slower. And then also, we have to take into consideration that if you've been stacking all the deck, like the deck in your favor, your margin for error with a tracking perspective, a training perspective, a lifestyle perspective, stress and sleep management is going to become much smaller. So it is true. If someone was to say it's easier for those that are new to training or obese to be able to recomp, that's absolutely true. But here's the thing. Just because something's true doesn't mean the opposite is untrue, meaning that if someone is more advanced or they have some training experience, yes, it becomes harder to achieve recomp, but it's not impossible. So the best way, like when I explain this to mentees, like the recomposition spectrum, I really like to say that it exists on a spectrum or on a continuum. At one end, you have beginners and higher body fat individuals who will see very noticeable, sometimes rapid recomposition. And then on the other end, you have advanced trainees where recomposition is slower, it's smaller in magnitude, and it requires a much higher level of execution. But it's very important to realize that this is not binary, whether like where it either happens or it doesn't happen. It's just kind of a magnitude of degree. And we really see that with the results we get, dependent on how dialed in that client was prior to coming to us, where they are. Yeah, there's many factors which we'll go over. And that will really determine what magnitude that person can recomp. But I'm going to say this point blank. I truly believe that about 95% of people that you see in a gym, a commercial gym especially, are capable of recomposition. And it's because many of them, even if they have been training for years or they've been working out for years, quote unquote, there's so many other variables within their training, their nutrition, their lifestyle, their sleep, their stress management, and every other variable that could be dialed in to elicit recomposition. So I really want to, across the course of this conversation, get across that this is not a training age dependent process, because a lot of times people will essentially associate the amount of years that they've been quote unquote in the gym for their level of advancement, and they're not one and the same.
Absolutely. So let's dig into what are the high level factors that would determine someone's ability to recomp.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is really important that we do cover because everyone wants to recomp. I mean, like I'm a coach, you're a coach, Jeremiah. I've been doing this 16 years at this point, and I think that every person that comes to me in their intake form, 9 out of 10 people are going to put, I want to lose fat and build muscle.
Yeah.
And this is a great goal to have. Don't get me wrong. And like I said, I think 95% of people can achieve this, but not everyone's equally positioned to do so. And not everyone's going to see the same magnitude of results. And so there's a few different key variables that we really need to go over that determine your likelihood of recomposition and then the degree to which it can occur. So the first is going to be your starting body composition. Really what I mean by that is your body fat percentage. So the higher your starting body fat, the more likely you are to recomp and the more significant that recomposition can be and it will appear. And the reason really comes down to energy availability. If you have higher levels of stored body fat, you have more endogenous energy available. So even if you're in a calorie deficit, your body can pull from those energy stores to support the muscle growth process, and recomp will be easier. Whereas if you're already lean, you simply don't have that same level of stored energy on your body. So recomp will be slower and it will be less drastic. Now, the next one is your training age and how you've trained. And this is very important to discuss. If you're someone that's newer to resistance training or you have been training but not in a structured, progressive way, those individuals have a much larger growth potential for building muscle, especially during this recomposition phase, especially when we're dialing things in and even in a deficit. And it's really just due to the fact that they're further from their genetic ceiling and we're introducing a novel stimulus that's more dialed in. Now, on the opposite side, if someone has years of consistent progressive hypertrophy training and they've already built a significant amount of muscle, they're much closer to their ceiling. So their rate of muscle growth is going to be slower and the likelihood of building muscle in a deficit is lower. Now, this doesn't mean that recomposition is possible. We just have to acknowledge that it's going to be more limited and more dependent on precise execution. Next factor is someone's overall experience level and level of execution, because really the biggest thing I can get across here is that recomposition is not impossible. It is difficult, but it's very execution dependent. It requires a high level of consistency across multiple variables, and that includes your training quality and the progression, your protein intake, your calorie control, your recovery habits, and your experience level matters not just in the gym, but with your nutrition, your consistency, your adherence, and especially with your mindset. So someone who is highly dialed in and consistent will almost always have a higher likelihood of recomping than someone that is inconsistent even if everything looks the same on paper, even if you give them the same program, if someone is not in a dialed in state and they don't have the mindset to really push themselves, to really want to check off all the boxes on a daily basis, they're not going to be in the most advantageous position to recomp. Now, the next factor is someone's lifestyle. So these are things like your sleep quality and duration, your stress levels, and then also your stress perception and your management of that stress, your time availability, and then your overall routine and structure, which all directly impact your ability to train intensely enough and recover well enough to build muscle while losing fat. And so, even if someone has the perfect training program and nutrition plan, if you have poor sleep and then really high stress, that can hinder your ability to recomp. And I'll tell you this personally, there have been many individuals that I've tried to elicit body recomposition with, and we've gotten somewhere, we've gotten some progress, but say in the middle of a phase, just their lifestyle changes, or it's been especially impactful when someone has went through an unexpected divorce, they've had a loss in the family, or they've had a move or a job change. And it's almost like it stops them in their tracks, and they're reporting to me their nutrition's the same. These are very dialed in, like experienced individuals that are I work with like high performers, whether it be from an executive perspective or a physique perspective, and they're still training just as hard. They're still nailing their nutrition, but it's the lack of sleep. It's the high levels of stress. It's the inability to manage and regulate their emotions that have really kind of put recomp, like almost stopped it in their tracks. So we can't overlook the sleep and stress component. And then the final factor is your nutritional setup. So the key things here are your total calorie intake, the size of the deficit we induce, your protein intake, and how well you're fueling your training. If your calorie intake is too low, or you push the deficit too aggressively, you try to get too far ahead of yourself, you're going to minimize your ability to build muscle in this phase. If your protein intake is insufficient, you won't have the building blocks needed for muscle growth or retention. And if your training isn't fueled properly, performance can drop, and that's really going to reduce the stimulus for hypertrophy. So really what I'm trying to do is strike a balance between enough of the deficit to drive fat loss, but enough fuel and protein to support muscle retention and to really put them in an advantageous position to grow.
Okay. So essentially, most new clients coming in are going to have a big ability to dial in their training more, their nutrition more, their lifestyle more. And the larger room we have to dial all those things in, the more capable we're going to be of recomp.
100%.
Cool. Okay, so let's dig into the physiological advantages that women specifically might have. So from a physiological standpoint, what is it about female biology that might make recomp more achievable?
So over the past like 13 years that I've been coaching specifically online, I've coached hundreds of men and hundreds of women, and I've recomped hundreds of clients of each sex. And the reason I brought this topic up to you, Jeremiah, is because I started noticing things. A few years ago, I'm working on like refining the nutritional periodization system I use with clients, and I was refining the primer phase that I take many of my clients through. And after going through a ton of my notes, data, and photo comparisons, I started noticing a trend where a higher percentage of the women that I worked with were achieving a significant degree of body recomposition. So I really started to think deeply about this. And we're going to go into detail on this, but I really wanted to know what was happening from a physiological perspective. And then, you know me, so I went down the rabbit hole looking for research to try to see if there was anything that could reinforce what I was seeing in practice. And I found it in the literature as well. So when I looked at the literature, it turned out that what I was seeing in real life with clients was being found in the research as well. And it turned out that women have a more favorable physiological environment for building and or maintaining lean mass while in a deficit, while losing body fat. And so the first and probably most impactful factor from a physiological perspective that drives this higher degree or higher likelihood for body recomposition is that women naturally carry higher levels of body fat than men. On average, we see that women have higher total body fat percentage and then a higher essential body fat level. And this is actually a physiological advantage in the context of recomp because that body fat represents stored energy. So when a woman is in a calorie deficit, her body has more endogenous energy available to pull from, which is going to support muscle growth and retention. Whereas men, especially as they get leaner, they tend to run into much of a tighter energy constraint as they start from a lower body fat percentage and also need to get to much lower levels of body fat than women do to look lean. Because we often see like a 8 to 10% discrepancy between men and women at the same level of leanness. So I'll give you an example. A man would need to get under like sub 10% body fat to achieve a very lean look, whereas most women will look really lean under 20% body fat. And we see the same thing in the context of like competitors. We see men getting down to 5%, whereas women are at 15, 16%. There's a massive discrepancy there. And so from a starting point perspective, women are often in a more advantageous starting point. Now, the second major factor as to why women have a lot higher likelihood for recomp, and this is something more recent literature has teased out, is that women tend to lose less lean mass and specifically skeletal muscle tissue during dieting compared to men. So when we look at research on the whole, and we look at losing weight without resistance training, men will often lose around 20 to 25% of their weight as lean mass. And that's what's called the quarter rule. You'll hear this colloquially said, but now as more literature has come out, especially in the last 2 years, we actually have more direct literature looking at this from a skeletal muscle mass perspective. So it was often assumed when you lost weight without resistance training, you were losing at least a quarter of your weight, so 25%, from lean mass itself. Now we're starting to see in more updated trials that men do lose around 20 to 25% of their weight as lean mass, whereas women often lose closer to 10 to 15%. And a newer 2024 trial looked at the proportion of weight that is lost during a deficit coming directly from skeletal muscle mass and found that women lost 10% of their weight from skeletal muscle mass, whereas men lost 23% of their weight from skeletal muscle mass. Now, the limitation here, and in this specific trial, is that these individuals were not on a progressive resistance training program or an optimized intake during these dieting studies. However, when training and protein are dialed in, women have a higher likelihood to gain lean mass or at least maintain it during a deficit, which is what we actually see in the bodybuilding case studies, looking at women competing across all divisions. So when I really got interested in this topic, and this is something that's still a hobby horse of mine, I went through all the bodybuilding case studies that I could find at that time. And there are, just objectively speaking, there's less in women than there are in men. But when I did a comparative analysis between the lean mass, they would have charts on like fat mass to lean mass loss. There was a much higher or much larger disproportionate loss in lean mass for men. And there was many trials when you actually look at the individual data points where women are losing body fat, but maintaining all their skeletal tissue or all their lean tissue, even when getting to contest prep levels of condition. Now, we can make an argument that men are getting much leaner, and there's different physiological advantage or physiological disadvantages for men. But at the same time, I see this in practice, and then also it's reinforced in the literature. And so, like we had went back to in the beginning, body recomp is not just about building muscle while losing fat, it's also about preserving lean mass while losing fat. And that's going to improve the lean mass to fat mass ratio. So women seem to have a physiological advantage there. Now, another physiological advantage that women have is the fact that their dominant female hormone is estrogen, whereas for men, it is testosterone. And estrogen plays a role that I think is often underappreciated in the physique space. It has several effects that are beneficial for recomposition. So if we look at estradiol, like from a mechanistic perspective, it's anti-catabolic, meaning that it's going to reduce or at least help reduce muscle protein breakdown. It also helps with reducing or managing muscle damage and inflammation, which can improve recovery. And then there's some mechanisms where it essentially activates a satellite cell activity and muscle repair. So overall, estrogen creates a more protective environment for skeletal muscle, especially during periods of energy restriction, which helps with recomp. And then last but not least, the women I tend to work with have more untapped hypertrophy potential than the men I work with. So I'm just going to say that from an experience perspective. A lot of women come into coaching with less structured resistance training experience and more of a background in dieting, in cardio, and then in like HIIT classes. So when I transition them into a structured hypertrophy program that is centered around progressive overload, and then I introduce adequate protein and nutrient timing, and I really build out like a comprehensive nutrition plan. I'm really very detail oriented with the meal plans that I make and the nutrition programs that I present to clients. I am not only making sure they're hitting their macronutrients, but also their micronutrients. And that is one thing I will just say, objectively speaking, in all my experience doing micronutrient tracking with clients, I find that women are much more often to come to me with micronutrient deficiencies that could be impairing their hormone production and their hormone conversion, especially from a thyroid and estradiol and progesterone perspective. And then also, they're much more likely to be in an underfueled state. So now when I shift them over into a more optimized program from both a training and a nutrition perspective, we're introducing a much larger stimulus that their body has never experienced. So they're able to lose fat from the deficit that we're creating, but it's going to be a calorie deficit, not a nutrient deficit. So we're inducing a small calorie deficit without the micronutrient deficits that they've run previously that has really left their body unable to fire on all cylinders. So they're losing fat from the deficit and they're simultaneously building muscle from the new training stimulus. And that combination is a very optimized setup for recomp.
Absolutely. I see the same thing very commonly with female clients where there's often much more of a health deficit almost, as you mentioned, like sex hormones, there's oftentimes a lot that could be improved. Same thing with thyroid. Um, what about when we're talking about substrate utilization? Like I've heard women potentially oxidize more fat at rest than men, for example. Is that accurate or is that just going to be case dependent?
Yes, so there are differences physiologically between men and women in terms of substrate utilization, and when we reference that, all we're really talking about is what fuel sources the body uses for energy, and we're looking at fats, carbs, and amino acids, and there's actually differences in all three. So on average, women tend to be have more of an oxidative metabolism. So what that means is they rely more heavily on fat as a fuel source. So compared to men, women will typically oxidize more fat during exercise. They'll burn through glycogen more slowly and they'll accumulate less lactate and metabolic byproducts during training. Whereas men tend to rely more heavily on carbohydrates during training. They burn through glycogen much faster and they shift towards fat utilization and oxidation during rest. So there's a bit of I think the best way to describe this is it's almost like an inverse relationship in how each sex uses fuel throughout the day. Women will utilize more fatty acids during training itself and then more carbohydrates during the course of the day. And men will do the opposite, where they'll oxidize more carbohydrates for energy during higher intensity training. And then the rest of the day, they'll be burning more fat. Now, because women are more efficient at using fat for fuel and have higher body fat levels than men, they're often very good at being able to tap into stored body fat to meet their energy demands, which is very helpful when the goal is to lose fat and to build muscle. Now, another component and another difference that we need to acknowledge is how men and women utilize glycogen, or essentially carbohydrate metabolism, because women will tend to spare glycogen to a greater degree during training. So they don't deplete glycogen as quickly, and they can often maintain performance better across sets and across sessions, which leads to a higher work capacity. And that's also referred to in the literature as a fatigue index. But it's really the fatigue index, what it really refers to is what is the drop off from set to set in terms of training performance. So oftentimes with men, if you have someone that is a very fast switch fiber dominant type of individual or doesn't have a good work capacity, we'll see, say we're doing 3 sets of 8 to 10, and they're taking it to the house on each set. We might see 10, 6, 3. Whereas with women, oftentimes you're seeing 10, 10, 10 or 10, 9, 8. They have very good work capacity in terms of their maintenance of performance across sessions. And that's really important from a hypertrophy training perspective because maintaining training performance is one of the biggest drivers of muscle retention and growth. Now, another thing that is a difference is in terms of substrate utilization is that women tend to rely less on amino acids as a fuel source compared to men. So in a deficit, men are slightly more likely to oxidize amino acids for energy, whereas women tend to preserve those amino acids to a greater extent. And this has led to like certain postulations in the literature that women need less protein than men. I don't see that as being the case because then we have the argument that progesterone is catabolic and then you need to increase protein demands during the luteal phase. These are arguments that are useless essentially. But really when it comes down to it, women are going to be able to essentially tap into amino acids less frequently than men. And that's really useful because then those amino acids that are in the amino acid pool can be used for muscle repair, recovery, and muscle protein synthesis. So overall, these sex-specific substrate differences really create a favorable setup for recomposition because women are going to be better at using fat for fuel and for energy. They're going to be better at preserving glycogen. They're going to be less reliant on protein as a fuel source. And they're also able to maintain training performance more effectively, which means that they can stay in a deficit, they'll lose body fat as a result, and they'll still be able to provide their body with enough of a stimulus as well as the resources to maintain or even build muscle.
All so interesting. So, as a whole, I mean, if we can handle more, like our recovery between sets, for example, is better. Would you say as a whole as well, like women are typically going to be able to manage more training volume across the course of a week, a month, like an extended time frame, or not necessarily?
No, I see anecdotally that women can handle, on average, more training volume than men. And really what that comes down to is that it's both from a recovery perspective, but it's also a fatigue perspective. So we actually
Yeah.
look, women tend to be less fatigable and they'll recover slightly better than men. And this has implications on how much training volume they can handle and they can benefit from. Now, like you mentioned, you had said, does this apply to everyone? It doesn't. There is no blanket statement that I could say that every single woman is going to respond better to higher volume. But I've looked at both the research and then I've compared it to what I've seen in practice, and there's some consistent trends. So if we want to discuss like the physiological differences in training between men and women, First, women tend to be less fatigable during resistance training, and that's something we see across a lot of the literature. So if you were to take a male and a female and you have them train at the same intensity, meaning the same percentage of the one repetition max, the female trainee can typically be able to do more reps per set, and they sustain work output across more sets, and then they accumulate more total work before reaching failure. And that was actually, Greg Nuckols has a great study from his master's thesis that looks at the bench press between men and women, and I don't remember the exact figures, but it's astronomical how many more reps at a certain percentage of a one repetition max the women in this trial. I mean, they got more reps per set and then more sets in totality because they had to hit a certain threshold. And it's an amazing difference between the two. And so we see in research that when we compare men and women, women are often going to be able to do more total reps at a given percentage of their max compared to men. Then women also tend to recover better within a training session. So between sets, they restore performance a bit faster. They clear metabolites more efficiently. They have better, essentially, blood perfusion. So they're able to really, when metabolites sequester, they're able to essentially eliminate them much quicker. And then they can maintain work output across a training session. And this can allow them to maintain training quality, accumulate more volume, and then get more productive work done in a session. Now, when we come back to the question of can women handle more training volume, I think on average, women often do respond well or better to slightly higher training volumes and then more total reps at a given intensity and sometimes higher training frequencies. But I really do want to discourage people taking that a little bit too far because we go back and forth with these volume debates within this industry. And I think oftentimes it's in the middle that we really want to strike almost like moderation. Just because women have better recovery capacity or less fatigability, that doesn't mean they should be doing excessive volume. We're just adding more for the sake of it because I have actually had a lot of women that have done excessively high volume training programs. I mean, 45 to 60 sets on a particular muscle group per week. And I've paired that back to something that is more moderate. It's not low by any means. I'm talking 15 to 20 sets. And they've actually responded far better, but it's because they were essentially weren't in, yes, women are less fatigable than men, but they still induce fatigue. So they're still accumulating these things. But just like with men, what you do from a training perspective, especially a training volume perspective, needs to be appropriate, it needs to be progressive, and it needs to be recoverable. And what I found in practice is that many female clients don't respond as well to very low volume approaches, whereas I do have some men that do, and they're often going to respond better to moderate to moderately high volumes, especially when that volume is well structured, it's focused on progression. And this is all going to connect back to recomposition because if someone can tolerate more volume, they can maintain higher training quality, and they can recover well enough to repeat that stimulus, they're going to be more likely to preserve muscle in a deficit or even build muscle in that deficit. So there are certain physiological advantages, both from a nutritional and fuel substrate utilization perspective, a total biological perspective, and then also training perspective that puts women in a very advantageous position to recomp, and where we can really take advantage from a coaching perspective and say, all right, all these factors are lining up in this person's favor. I'm looking at their entire intake. Like I take clients through a very comprehensive intake process. I'm looking at their training experience. I'm looking at every single component of what they've done previously to get them to where they are today. And that's where we make the coaching decision. All right, we know that this person has the physiological advantages, but do they have the lifestyle advantage or lifestyle factors lined up, or do they have, are they in a great place to be able to elicit this effect? Let's push for it.
Okay, absolutely. From a coaching perspective, I know that is something that I have had to check myself on in the past in many regards, like making sure I'm not looking at a program and like how someone's logbook is progressing and the numbers I'd expect to see or like the volume someone's doing, and just taking my own experience with like, oh shit, well, this looks like I couldn't handle this lower body day. Like they can't either, right? Where, hey, they might do very well with that amount of volume. Or even I think of like, hey, I'm seeing like you did like 3 sets here for the same weight for the same reps. We're not pushing hard enough. Send me a video of your second set, not just your first set. And I was like, oh shit, oh yeah, we're crushing it. Okay, like again, that's been very helpful for me to understand as well as like not just extrapolating my own experience onto every one of my clients because there are a lot of differences here. Fascinating though, just how many different physiological advantages it does seem are stacked towards women in this regard.
100%. I want to just make a quick coaching anecdote right here. So years ago when I was competing, I had a good friend of mine that ended up becoming an IFBB figure pro. And she was someone that grew up with me. her father actually got me into bodybuilding. So this was like a family friend that I knew for a very long time. She was a few years younger than me. And so I saw her come up through high school and then into college. And she had just gotten out of college, and I was already in my mid to late 20s, and I was competing and I was fitness modeling, and I thought I was, a hard trainer to say the least. And I remember that her father was a very hard training individual. He was in a 1970s and 80s bodybuilder, very old school, like those 3 hour marathon workouts used to just bury us into the dirt. Well, she grew up in that kind of context. And when she decided that she was going to leave, she exited out of college and she stopped playing sports. Resistance training really became her main priority. And it took me seeing that firsthand on a daily basis of her training with me and her father, which were many years older than her, much more experienced and obviously stronger. But when we would push her to the capacity that we thought a male should be pushed to, she could also often recover like almost on the drop of a dime. It was like 60 seconds. We were out of breath on the ground and she was already recovered. So we had to utilize different techniques. And there was often, it really came down to a factor where we realized that for us, in the particular training phase that we were in, we were doing 3 working sets. And we actually ended up increasing hers because she was not getting the same stimulus. She was recovering so efficiently and productively and adequately, but we were increasing her. I was helping her from a nutrition perspective, and her dad was really dictating the workouts for us. We realized she could handle so much more, so we increased it. So she did about 33% more volume than us in totality. And that was really a good real life example because this was someone I was training with every single day. And she ended up going to the highest end of the sport. She ended up becoming an IFBB pro. And I always look back on those memories because that was a real world example that I saw every single set that she did. I saw every single training session. This was 5 to 6 days a week. I knew what she was eating. And we had a very close relationship. And that was a good early on in my coaching career. This was well over 10 years ago. It was a good real life example. Like, listen, just because you and your bodybuilding friends train hard, that doesn't mean that women cannot handle a different level and may need that to get to the precipice of where they're trying to get.
Oh, absolutely. It's just like someone's calorie intake, right? Like 1,500 calories might be absolutely terrible for you, but the relative degree to which it hurts for them might be the same as like 2,200 for you.
Hell
So
yeah.
let's talk coaching experience. From a coaching X's and O's perspective, what are the most common mistakes you're seeing women specifically making that we can correct to allow for recomp?
Yeah. So honestly, out of all the questions you sent me, this is probably the most important thing we can cover because despite the fact that women have physiological advantages for recomp, a lot of them are unwilling or unknowingly working against themselves and not taking advantage of those advantages, especially with how they're approaching training, nutrition, and progression tracking. And these are patterns I see over and over again. So the biggest mistake that I see by far is being overly focused on the scale and using that as the be all end all metric of progress, not only from a psychological perspective in terms of how they're evaluating their progress, but also letting the essentially scale readings dictate the changes that they make on their own or that they try to get their coach to make for them. And so a lot of women come into a phase, whether they're doing it themselves or they're coaching with one of us, they're expecting consistent, rapid scale weight drops. And when that doesn't happen, they assume something isn't working because psychologically, they have been programmed over the years, especially with social media and pop media, to associate scale weight drop with success rather than looking at things from a body composition perspective. And really, that is one of the biggest key differentiating factors between men and women because men are a lot less, there still are men that are very scale weight focused, but we're much less attached to the scale. And so a lot of times, women, when they don't see that happening, they think that there's something they're doing is wrong or they need to do more. They need to do a harsher deficit. They need to do more cardio. They need to get their activity up. But if that individual is losing fat, gaining or maintaining muscle, improving performance, and looking leaner, the scale weight, the scale might drop slower, it may stay flat, or it may fluctuate more. And that's actually a sign that recomposition is happening. But what ends up happening is more times than not, they panic and they assume progress has stalled, and then they slash calories further, they increase cardio unnecessarily, and that can actually kill the potential that they have for recomp, or it could kind of put recomp in stop it in its tracks. And so that's why so many women have had this potential physiologically, and maybe they were in the initial phases with a coach and it was working, but they fought against it, or they decided to do extra. Like I've had many cases, and I'm going to be completely frank with you, where I've had a woman that everything is going perfectly, and a few weeks later, say the first 6 weeks is going phenomenally, first 6, 8, 10 weeks. And I start giving them feedback like, listen, you're recomp. I'm giving them objective feedback, but I'm like, I don't need to make many changes right now. So it's not week to week that I'm drastically overhauling their training or their nutrition. I'm like, listen, let's just keep this momentum going. You don't break, you don't fix what's not broke. And you're in a really good pattern where you're firing on all cylinders. I want to just keep this momentum going. And when a change needs to occur, I will make it, but only if it's, going to be advantageous for you and it's going to push you further. And we've gotten, say, into week 16, I've noticed like towards the latter portion, and this was something I noticed early on in coaching. And now, because I've had this experience and I've had these interactions, now I kind of just call people out on it, to be honest. But I've had women that have told me at the end of that phase that, for the last 4 to 6 weeks, I've been increasing cardio, I've been eating less, I've been pulling, portions out of my meals or skipping a meal. And then when I look back across the course of their phase, I see that their composition was improving much more favorably during the first 10 weeks where they were dialed in, when they got impatient with that process or they thought that they needed to do more and they decided to make their own unnecessary changes to the program. That's when recomposition started to fall off in terms of their actual progression. And we don't end the phase as in as favorable of a position as we could. Now, the second mistake that I see that's very common is underfueling and undereating, especially from a protein intake perspective and a carbohydrate intake perspective. So a lot of women are chronically underfueling themselves. They go into aggressive deficits, and many have lower protein intakes than what would be optimal. So that creates a really poor environment for recomposition, because if calories are too low, your recovery and performance suffer. If protein is too low, then you don't have the building blocks for muscle. So even if they're training hard, they're not creating the conditions needed to maintain muscle, let alone to build it. And so this is one of the biggest shifts I make with female clients. I'm going to bring energy availability up to a more appropriate level. I'm going to make sure that protein is up to a level that actually supports muscle growth, retention, and higher energy expenditure levels, as well as satiety and their goals as a whole. Because it's not just about doing what is conducive for body composition. We also have to look at what's conducive for adherence and consistency and sustainability, because recomp is a slow process. So this is not a short fat loss phase that you could just white knuckle your way through. It needs to be set up in a manner that is sustainable and that you can adhere to, because it's going to be a longer phase and we really want you to stay as consistent as possible. Now, another huge mistake is how they're training. A lot of women are either not resistant training consistently and intensely, or they're going into the gym and just winging it. And then the other factor to that are those that are constantly program hopping. I can't tell you how many women that I get from group coaching containers where they have essentially been programmed or educated or miseducated into changing their program every 4 weeks. So what ends up happening is essentially what's going on. And if we look at the literature, and this is something I have a podcast coming out soon as to why you need to stop changing your training program every 4 to 6 weeks. And really the reason I say that is because A, it's super common. And secondarily, we have 2 types of adaptations that can take place from resistant training. The first is neurological adaptations, which is essentially hardware, adaptations. And really what I mean by that is it's improvements in technical proficiency, movement effectiveness, really your execution. And that can last for 3 to 5 weeks. Until you get out of that neurological adaptation phase, we really don't see what are called morphological adaptations, which is the addition of contractile proteins, or really what we're looking for, body composition improvements and lean mass increase or lean mass addition. And what ends up happening is a lot of women are on group coaching programs, or they're in group training atmospheres where they're constantly being given a new workout. So they're essentially training for entertainment and for fatigue rather than for progression and for really inducing a potent stimulus. And so oftentimes with these programs, there's no progression, there's no progressive overload, and there's no clear structured program in place. And without that progressive overload, there's really no reason for your body to build muscle or even to retain it while dropping body fat. And so recomposition is going to require a strong hypertrophy stimulus. So this is where I really aim to shift those individuals into a structured program with a progression scheme in place, where they're focusing on tracking their lifts, they're getting stronger over time, and we're really focusing on progression as a main priority, which is we're using as the main tool to shift their body composition. So instead of looking at training as a method of burning calories, or looking at, doing training with insufficient rest periods, or kind of doing almost like intervals or circuit training, I'm really trying to get them to look at each single movement as something that we need to aim for progression and efficiency on, in terms of great execution and better training quality. Another mistake that I see a lot of women making, and especially a lot of women that come to me for coaching, they're doing excessive cardio and they're doing a lot of HIIT cardio or HIIT classes. And while cardio has its place, it's not the primary driver of body composition change, especially when it comes to building muscle. And this is why so many women say that they feel like they work really hard, but they don't feel like they look like they lift. And really, that's coming down to the fact that they're focusing so much on burning calories through their training that they're becoming a smaller version of themselves rather than a better version of themselves. The next one is poor peri-workout nutrition and fueling. And this is one that a lot of people overlook, but it does matter. I constantly see people taking a suboptimal approach to their peri-workout nutrition and fueling for training. And a lot of women are under fueling around training, or they're training fasted, or they don't have adequate carbohydrates pre and post workout. And that's going to impact their performance, their training quality, and their recovery. And if that training performance suffers, that hypertrophy stimulus is going to suffer as well. And then the last mistake that I do have to hit on is mindset related. And the process of body recomposition is generally slower. It's certainly not linear, and then it's less obvious on the scale. So if someone is expecting rapid weight loss or they're expecting immediate visual changes, they're more likely to abandon the process early or constantly change approaches, or they're constantly looking for us to change, make changes. And oftentimes in that scenario, I have to explain that the best change is no change because what we're doing is working, and we need to give your body the necessary time to induce that stimulus and actually respond to it. And also so that I can collect accurate data to make the most appropriate adjustments rather than just making adjustments to keep you entertained or to induce some type of novelty. We're looking for progression, not novelty. And really what it comes down to is recomp requires consistency, patience, and especially trust in the process. So when progress isn't always reflected by the scale, you have to be willing to be patient and buy into the process and realize that what you've done previously, if you are someone that anytime you didn't see the progress you were, or what you were associating with progress, meaning you didn't see the scale weight crashing down, you switched to a new approach and you are that same person. So you're that person that associates progress with scale weight changes. But you're also the person that is sitting here in this audience listening to us and saying, you know what, I'm a female, I've been training a long time, but I don't feel like I look like I lift, and I've never achieved recomp. The reason you may have never achieved recomp is because you constantly are switching approaches. You're never buying into the process, and you haven't been patient enough to really dial things in and let them run its course for a long enough time with an experienced professional that has done this dozens and hundreds of times and really trusted in that and given your body enough time to respond.
I think that aspect of coaching is very important. It's easy to think that a coach is just here to make changes every week, but I always express this like, hey, if I don't have to change anything, that tells us things are working extremely well, right? Like that is what we want. That's the ideal scenario. To add to that, couple common things I see, especially with like individuals coming from, because we have a decent amount of people who have already been training for a good amount of time and like in a hypertrophy specific manner. But a lot of times it's almost just like overly specific training, right? Where it's like, hey, we're in this training, like a kind of a group training program where we're really focused on glutes and delts. So maybe you're doing like a glute focused leg press with a tiny range of motion and you have like 10 different glute kickback variations in your program and like 10 different cable lateral raise variations. But it's like, okay, so show me what your goal physique looks like. All right, so this person has a lot more quads than you, a lot more lats than you, like their entire body, they have a lot more tissue than you. And we're being so specific with all these, a lot of times like more short biased movements as well, where we just need to prioritize adding more tissue across the board. And a lot of times like challenging those tissues in the length and range as well. Upper body also like lats, I think are a lot of times a lot of women have just deprioritized to a degree upper body. Like again, lats are a big one where it's like, a lot of clients starting, hey, we really like have never learned how to train our lats, nor do we have a whole lot of tissue there, right? Where like for the physique you want, if you want kind of like that V taper or hourglass shape, that is such a huge part of that. And I think like little things like that are often missed. But again, not always, but a lot of women have just deprioritized upper body training as a whole. So there's such a big potential to like see such a big shift there because we can add tissue there so quickly, which is really cool.
Yeah, I do want to comment on that. What I see in practice, and there's also some literature that looks at this. There's a review by Martin Ruffalo and then also Brandon Roberts, and this is looking at the differences or more so similarities in muscle growth potential between men and women. And what they're seeing oftentimes is that performance in the upper body, we see a more substantial improvement in upper body training performance between men and women. And now when we look at the broad body literature, men and women have the same maximum muscular potential in terms of their relative increases, meaning if both a man and a woman go into a training intervention on average, now there's some heterogeneity in this, but from a homogeneous perspective, most are going to respond in a very similar manner. So say there's certain studies that see a 10% increase in fat-free mass or skeletal muscle mass. And that's going to apply both to the men in that trial that are on the same training program and the women. Now, the differences between those are that men are starting with the higher physiological baseline in terms of their total fat-free mass. So say that a man has 70 kilograms of, fat-free mass. If they increase 10%, they're going to gain 7. Whereas a woman has 40, she's only going to gain 4. So in terms of absolute perspective, there's differences. But what I will say is there's literature that reinforces that women see better strength progression in terms of total increases in strength in the upper body. And really, when I think about that logically or practically from a coaching perspective, I see that in practice. And my explanation for that, and they don't tease this out in the literature, but my explanation for that is that many women have undertrained their upper body. So from a maximum muscular perspective, and then also a proximity to their genetic potential or their maximum, ceiling of genetic potential, I think that a lot of women are in a position where they could afford, and they're also set up to gain much more muscle if they're willing to take a more global and a more balanced approach. Whereas I have a lot of women that they really only train their lower body, or they put no emphasis on their upper body. And these are just shifts that we can make. I do a lot of priority or specialization phases. This is a conversation that we've had previously in a full series. I do a lot of like delt specialization cycles with women or back, or there's certain areas that we could accentuate that will build their physique, not just from a lower body perspective. And oftentimes we could really get a lot out of a more global perspective and just dialing everything in. I really like that you hit on the short and biased perspective. I find I get a lot of people from group coaching containers, and this is not to say every group coaching container is poor in their approach, but I do want to point out the fact that with many of these group coaching containers, they're trying to induce as much novelty to keep you engaged in the program, because if they're not doing your nutrition, they're not doing check-ins, there's no other reason for you to stay around. So they switch things every 4 weeks. Well, if you haven't even gotten through the neurological phase, which, as I mentioned previously, it's 3 to 5 weeks, you're not tapping into morphological adaptations, but they are tricking you, or you're essentially being tricked into thinking you're making progression, because if you switch your movements every 4 weeks you get better at something new. Now, that doesn't mean that you actually added contractile tissue and you've gotten to a point where that force production is increasing due to an increase in skeletal muscle mass. You're just essentially getting neurological gains. You're getting changes in just your movement proficiency every 4 weeks. Now, with that, there's a lot of issues that come along with that, because there's no real focus on really staying in a program long enough to see the actual changes to your body composition. People are more so looking at the programming changes as what's going to elicit change, where in reality, you need to give the program a long enough time for your body to change in response to the adaptations that that program is causing. So there's many things, and you had mentioned the short bias, which I wanted to get back to. A lot of times there's many programs that are set up in a way that they make you feel something. You're feeling a sensation from a movement, but that doesn't mean it's the greatest stimulus. So a great example of this would be for hamstring and glute development. If we were to look at something like RDL versus a kickback or things of that sort, a lot of times women will tell me they feel the kickback more strongly in their glutes, or even, if we were to do a 45-degree hip extension. But really, when we see it from a total stimulus perspective, and then also when we think about what creates a good movement, the target musculature is the limiting factor first and foremost. It's loadable and progressible. It's hitting the target musculature and it's putting it in a lengthened position. The RDL is going to be much more advantageous from a total muscle building perspective than the kickback. It's not that you can't do both. It's that there's many programs that are only focused on short bias movements or sensation inducing movements, and you're feeling something, they're inducing fatigue or sweat or some feeling of exhaustion. This can be said about HIIT training classes as well. So you feel like you're working hard, but you're actually not hitting that target stimulus in a manner that's going to induce the adaptation which we want, which is muscle growth, physique development, and the sculpting of your actual physique. So you have that defined, toned, and muscular physique that you're looking for.
I think I have that conversation about RDLs specifically at least a couple times every week, where it's like, hey, I don't really feel this super targeted in my glutes. Am I doing it wrong? It's just kind of feel terrible in general, listening your entire posterior chain working, and that's normal. Or the weight feels really heavy and it feels hard to hold, and it's that's doing an RDL for you. Yep, that's what we expect. Good thing. Do you want to try to get into the programming and nutrition implication side of things? Do you want to hold off?
Let's do that on part 2, my friend. Because we're
cool.
We're
I was going to say we might be a little bit rushed there to get through that. All right, so let's go ahead and wrap it up here. What we will do, this next conversation we have, is discuss just some application in terms of how this would impact the way you would program, both nutrition and training for a female client chasing recomp, how that would impact our timelines, kind of the phases we would work through and things of that nature. So that'll be a really fun conversation as well. But in the meantime, we'll go ahead and wrap it up here. Any final thoughts you want to leave the audience with before we close?
Yeah, I think the biggest one from this portion of the conversation, obviously we haven't gotten into really like the X's and O's, which we'll go into more detail in terms of how I approach training or how I approach nutrition, really like the coaching application perspective. I think from this first portion of the podcast, I think the most applicable takeaway would be that recomposition is possible even if you're beyond the newbie stage. But if you're looking to achieve simultaneous muscle gain and fat loss, you need to be willing to try a new approach. You cannot continue doing what you've done previously. And I say that because one of the most common conversations I have with a new person that comes to me for coaching is they want to achieve this, but they want to continue doing very similar things that they've done in the past. And that's just, there's an incongruence between your goal and the method that is needed to get you to that next level physique. So really when it comes down to it, this is, I genuinely believe, and I say this from looking at the research, but also even more importantly, I've worked with over 1,200 people. I really do think that the vast majority of people can achieve some degree of body recomposition. And this doesn't mean that you have to be carrying excessive body fat. You have to be brand new to training. I think even a lot of people that would be considered intermediate trainees could really accomplish this and really could achieve this. But you have to be willing to try a new approach. You have to be willing to push yourself and dial in your training from an execution, a quality, and a programming perspective. There's certain things you may have to do that are repetitive and boring, but you have to become a master at these movements. You need to be willing to dial in your nutrition and be more accurate and more precise with your approach to nutrition, and be willing to undo some of the maladaptive habits you have, especially from a fueling perspective. This is not about training fasted or trying to increase fatty acid oxidation during resistance training. That is going to impair your ability to recomp. So you have to be willing to take on a different mentality to fueling in terms, or nutrition in terms of fueling yourself for the work required, fueling yourself for the process of pushing yourself to your maximum potential in the gym and then recovering sufficiently after it. And then also there's that lifestyle piece. You have to be willing to dial in your sleep more, manage your stress, integrate things that are going to be outside of the context of the gym or the kitchen, but that are going to have massively beneficial effects for you. So stress management, emotional regulation. And you have to be willing to take yourself to a new level. And really, when that all combines, when all those factors are aligned appropriately and in a well-programmed, complete like coaching type of methodology, you will be surprised at the type of results that you get. I encourage you. Oftentimes, I will take people through a primer phase first and foremost, and at this point, I do these in a much more extended fashion than I did previously. But you could see a lot of times I'll post, 3 or 4 or 6 months into that primer phase. And within that, a lot of times the goal of that phase not only to improve someone's physiology and to prime them for the next phase that we're going to after, but a lot of times with certain individuals, I'll really focus on body recomposition. So I encourage you to go to my page. It's at @DaCruz_, and you can look at dozens of examples of women that have recomp themselves. So realize it is possible for you. This is not like the people that Jeremiah or I post are not special snowflakes, that they're individuals that have been willing to elevate their standards. They're willing to raise the bar. They're willing to take constructive criticism and feedback from an experienced coach, and really willing to really raise the level of execution, consistency, and what they do over time to be able to elicit this next level physique. And if that is something you're interested in, I'm telling you, this type of process of achieving body recomposition will not only change your physique, but it'll change your life, because you will really see how much you're truly capable of. And that's a beautiful process to partake in, watch, and witness as a coach. So the biggest takeaway from this is you're capable of doing this. You just have to be willing to dial more things in and not kind of like wing the process of nutrition, training, lifestyle design, and just expect that this is going to happen. Because if you do, you're going to stay where you are.
I'm so glad you touched on that. I get a lot of individuals coming from that background where it's like the type of recomp where we need to basically maintain or potentially even add a bit of body fat and build muscle. And that's how we're going to get you to the physique you want if you want to recomp. That's like that's the door for them. But a lot of times it's easy to like look at coaching like, oh, sick, I get a program, and they're going to give me macros, right? But a lot of times if you're that person, this means you're going to have to be willing to recover better than you have in the past, right? You might have to be willing to not do 20,000, 25,000 steps every day. We might have to be willing to pull that back, or like not saving all of your calories for the very end of the day for like the giant creamy you have, and better fueling, like things like that, or prioritizing your sleep and managing that better. The things like that that are less sexy aspects of it but are just as important for getting there. It's a very good point there. As we close out, just let everybody know where they can find you and anything at all you would like to plug.
Absolutely. Guys, first and foremost, Jeremiah, it is always an absolute pleasure. So I appreciate you having me on, and I'm glad we'll be able to pick this up and not rush through it, because I know you sent me a hell of an outline, and I don't want to neglect that, because I think this audience will really benefit from that. But guys, if you're listening to this podcast, I'm sure that you love other podcasts. I would really encourage you to check out my podcast, which is the Chasing Clarity podcast. I've actually done a multi-part series, I believe a 2-part series on body recomposition in a lot more detail. So this will cover things that are outside. I'm going to go more into the research. You'll have citations and all those type of things than what we covered today. This is more specific to Jeremiah's audience, but I do encourage you to check that out. And then if you're someone who takes your physique seriously, you want to operate at a higher standard, and you really want to elevate the results that you're getting, and you're looking for structured evidence-based approach, feel free to reach out to me directly for coaching. You guys can find me on Instagram, which is @DaCruz_, or you can email me directly at bdacruzfitness@gmail.com. And as always, Jeremiah, it is always a pleasure, my friend. I appreciate the conversation and the insightful questions that you ask me, because they always keep me thinking, and really allows me to pull out a lot of experience, evidence. And I think that this allows us to have great discourse between the two of us, where we can really share a lot of insights that we've learned over the years.
Yeah, I always enjoy our conversations too. And I love every time I share that we did an episode together, I always get a bunch of DMs about how excited people are to listen to them. So it means a lot that listeners enjoyed as well. But I will link up everywhere to find Brandon in the show notes. Always can't recommend anything he does highly enough. And we will catch you guys in the next part.